Thank you very much. Terry Eagleton, in his 1991 book of the title Ideology and Introduction, makes the observation that ideology as a term or critique of ideology as a practice has gone out of favor, or at least at the time of the writing of the book, he had observed that it had gone out of favor. And he gives two explanations for this, two explanations from opposed political camps, if you will. The first explanation for the disfavor of ideology at that time, or critique of ideology, was that after the fall of the Soviet Union and sort of installation of full spectrum dominance of global capitalism, that replacement had no ideology in itself, and after the fall of the Soviet Union there was no sort of need for the critique of ideology, or that ideology was no longer in the ascendant in a political sphere, global political sphere. And that was the perspective, like the right-wing perspective in America, or in UK for that matter. And on the other hand, the other explanation that he gives is from a different perspective, different political perspective. It comes more from what would be associated with the leftist or liberal perspective, that critique of ideology, or at least ideology in a pejorative sense, depends upon certain metaphysical commitments to absolute truth, or to essences, or to the idea that we can make reference, concrete reference to the world with signs without a necessary ambiguity, and that this is a kind of totalitarianism in itself, or a kind of authoritarianism. And so this is associated with discourse theory, postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-Marxism. These are the people that are skeptical of the possibility of having a strong pejorative definition of ideology. Eagleton's claim is that without a more specified definition of ideology, it really loses its critical strength, its critical force. If we have just this overgeneralized, inflated definition of ideology as worldview, or ideology as way of seeing things, it has no descriptive value. So he sees this kind of commitment to moral realism, as he calls it, or at least commitment to the idea of discourse-independent reality, and that we can indeed talk about it with some certainty. He thinks it's necessary to critique of ideology. So, dismissing the first explanation, that is, we don't need ideology anymore because the Soviet Union is gone, we can just dismiss that claim as the facile nonsense that it is. But the second claim, about ideology requiring certain metaphysical commitments, and that these metaphysical commitments make postmodernists a bit uncomfortable, this is a main interest of my talk, because, well, as I'll get to, he blames this inflation of discourse in late ideological critique, he blames it on semiotics squarely, he says, as I'll show. Oh yeah, but why does he pose this question? Why does he begin his book this way, and why is it that he sees it as a strange thing that critique of ideology has lost favor? Is because he gives the examples, at least in 1991 when the book was published, he saw a rise of Islamic fundamentalism on the one hand, and Christian evangelicalism in USA, strongly, Margaret Thatcher in UK, and the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe also, and he saw these things as in the ascendant at the time of writing the book, and it's strange that was in 1991. Well, it's definitely, I guess it was a prescient observation of his, that these ideological movements were going to continue to gain strength, and that maybe critique of ideology isn't so passé as some might want to claim. So, regarding this skepticism towards the possibility of a pejorative definition of ideology, just makes a further observation. He calls it an epistemological skepticism, which would hold that the very act of identifying a form of consciousness as ideological entails some untenable notion of absolute truth. That is, postmodernist thought tends to see all ideology as teleological, totalitarian, and metaphysically grounded. So I guess my argument is sort of two-sided regarding this. Is, in the first place, I find it postmodern distrust of any kind of static semiotic methodology for access to reality, that this distrust is warranted. I consider myself a postmodernist to that extent. But at the same time, I do think that the critique of ideology requires a moral realism grounded in the faith, in the fact that there is discourse independent reality and that we can get at it. It's problematic how we get at it, but we can get at it. And in the end, I'll just show that it's Peircean semiotics. Like maybe we can blame a certain kind of semiotic thinking on the relativism of postmodernism and so on, but we don't need to ditch semiotics entirely, and it's not semiotics per se which brings this relativism. And I'd say Peircean semiotic realism is a good antidote to this supposed problem of ideological critique. So in the book, he gives 16 tentative definitions of ideology. One of the problems with the critique of ideology, and one of the reasons it's gone out of favor, is because of the plurality of definitions of ideology, the difficulty of defining it. So the definitions are not mutually exclusive. They are frequently overlapping, but some of them do exclude others. And all of them are either neutral, pejorative, or positive. And some of them are a blend. And it's the 13th definition, semiotic closure. I don't know if you can see that, maybe not. Semiotic closure, which is the focus of the last chapter of the book, which is called Discourse in Ideology. And it's in this chapter that he addresses the late ideological critique of, among others, of Michel Foucault, Laclau, Ernesto Laclau, and then also Lacan, Jacques Lacan, Julia Kristeva, and also this Valentin Voloshinov, and others. And not all of them does he accuse of having this relativism, this epistemological and moral relativism that he thinks is so deadly to critique of ideology. But he definitely squarely attacks Laclau, Kristeva, Foucault. And he also groups in, he says that Theodor Adorno, anticipated this postmodern drift towards relativism, which led to the decline in interest in ideological critique. But as I said, this definition of this late ideological critique is, as he says, semiotic closure. I don't know if you can read it. Semiotic closure is what the kind of the style of critique of ideology which is under consideration in this chapter. And so, again, he blames Saussure for the kind of destruction or the loss of interest in the critique of ideology, because this Saussurean arbitrary relation between signifier and signified has no commitment, no metaphysical or ontological commitment, and all about this like free play between signifier and signified, which leads to this ethical, moral, and ontological relativism. And he says a bit about that. And by these figures, he means, Adorno, all the Frankfurt School, Foucault, Laclau, Kristeva, Lacan. Zizek wasn't so popular by that point, but he'd probably include Zizek. It is on the basis of the work of these figures that he summarizes semiotic closure as a set of effects, quote, whereby certain forms of signification are silently excluded and certain signifiers fixed in a commanding position, fixing the otherwise inexhaustible process of signification around certain dominant signifiers with which the individual subject can then identify. Language itself is infinitely productive, but this incessant productivity can be artificially arrested into closure, into the sealed world of ideological stability which repels the disrupted, decentered forces of language. This approach to ideological critique serves to, quote, demonize the act of semiotic closure, betrays an anarchic suspicion of meaning as such, and it falsely assumes that closure is always counterproductive. And again, here we are. Here he is squarely blaming semiotics for This distrust, Saussurean linguistics is once more craftily harnessed to the cause of social reformism. The semiotic model which governs the thinking here misleadingly is thus the Saussurean one between signifier and signified, or word and concept, rather than that between sign and referent. But harnessing the cause of social reformism, what he means there is that instead of revolution, we're talking piecemeal, incremental change, which is not so committed to any particular leftist or otherwise political discourse. Such commitment makes the postmoderns uncomfortable, this is his argument. And we're going to just have to leave aside his attribution of all these qualities to Saussure. I think it's a bit of a misreading or a shallow or naive reading of Saussure to think that it either does or doesn't have any of these commitments, either to relativism or realism or any of that. But we can just leave that aside. The point would be that semiotics as a practice in general does not bring this relativism, regardless of whether Saussure's system does or doesn't, but that we do have a better, more comprehensive system to make use of, in my opinion, which incontrovertibly does not have these faults which Eagleton is attributing to semiotics as such. Yes, and that's Charles Peirce's semiotics. Another point, though, regarding semiotic closure is just that I'll explain what this means later on. But so all ideology implies semiotic closure, but not all semiotic closure is ideological. As you can see here, he's making the claim that these late critics of ideology influenced by semiotics are demonizing semiotic closure. But as we know, semiotic closure or generalizations are necessary to all cognition. There's no thinking without generalizations, without closure. And so to say that all semiotic closure is ideological would be to commit to this inflated definition of ideology, whereas we want a pejorative definition, ideology, because it has more explanatory power. So we have to maintain that not all semiotic closure is ideological, but all ideology implies semiotic closure. And by semiotic, I'll be more specific what I mean by semiotic closure once I roll out a few of these Peircean terms, which need to be disambiguated in order to make these specifications. It happens that although we know more about Peirce now, certain scholars of Peirce 20 years ago or more were making these attributions, the same attributions that Eagleton puts to Saussure, some were trying to put on Peirce. Because as we know, as we're transitioning into Peirce's semiotic, as we know, one of the popular key features of semiosis for Peirce is this unlimited semiosis. Yes, every sign, in order to be a sign, the interpretant has to be translated into a new sign, becomes a new representamen or sign vehicle. Yes, so this infinite, unlimited translatability, generation of new meaning is a precondition. It's a circular definition of the sign, but it's a precondition of the sign. I'm sure you're familiar with that, but it was Eco who kind of came up with this, Umberto Eco. He didn't just snatch it out of thin air, but maybe he was a bit selective with some of the passages from Peirce about this hard translation theory of meaning, and attributing that to Peirce. But in doing so, he was trying to maybe just compare him more with Saussure, or to show that there's not such a big difference. And he quotes Derrida, Jacques Derrida, quoting Peirce about exactly this indefiniteness of reference in Peircean sign theory because of unlimited semiosis. The representamen, or sign vehicle, functions only by giving rise to an interpretant that itself becomes a sign, and so on to infinity. And this, in Derrida's reading, in the first sentence, you can see he considers this to be a kind of deconstruction of the transcendental signified. A transcendental signified would be some kind of discourse-independent reality to which we can make reference. And so by deconstructing this, he's simply saying there's no way to achieve this transcendental signified. Any semiotic system is going to be relative to changing discourse conditions. And so Eco, and via Derrida, Eco is putting this relativism on Peirce's system. Well, before I move on, by means of this argument about unlimited semiosis, Eco then attributes to Peirce a conventionalist argument where all signs are culturally dependent and conventional. Like all signs are symbols, effectively, icons aren't really real. There's no like real similarity in the world. He also puts on this doctrine of thought signs. All signs are thoughts. All signs are like logical interpretants, if you will. You could say this about Peirce's early work, but he changed this, as you know, and considers even emotional and energetic interpretants to also be real interpretants, that is, to be semiotic. And so we can definitely reject that, along with T.L. Short. T.L. Short he wrote a big, very authoritative book about Peirce. It's called Peirce's Theory of Signs. It's very good. But it's not quite what it purports to be. It's also rather argument-driven and rather speculative. If you read very closely and then you look at the citations, you can see he takes some bit of poetic license in his interpretations, but still, it is argument-driven as well. And his main argument is a refutation of the thought signs doctrine. That is the early doctrine of Peirce that all signs are logical or rational or something, or symbolic. Refutation of this, and by means of refuting unlimited semiosis. Yes? And so, in this new doctrine, the claim is that no, in order to be a sign does not need to be translated in a new sign, but what that sign requires is to be translatable into a concrete habit of action, which is not a sign. And this is the doctrine of so-called ultimate interpretant. Yes? The ultimate interpretant is like the end of the chain of semiosis. And for Short, this is the source of all meaning for T.L. Short. So these questions about the relation of the ultimate interpretant to the final interpretant and the status of the translation theory of meaning in Peirce's work, these are the questions that pertain to semiotic closure, the idea of semiotic closure and how we can describe it. Basically, it is these questions which help us sort out semiotics of critique of ideology, if you will. Because ideology is exactly about this. Authoritative control of the discourse and limitation of possible interpretations, channeling of people's thinking, groups of people's thinking into a particular area and getting them to ignore other things. It's about limiting semiosis, or maybe even terminus of semiosis. This is what ideology, semiotic closure is about. So whether Peirce's sign is defined by its limitlessness, or on the contrary, according to Short, if the meaning of the sign is on the contrary determined by it ending, by having an ultimate interpretant, an end point. This is a very important debate, and it's an unresolved. Needless to say, I have my own opinions about the situation. Addressing the question, the reason why Eco is so confident about the status of thought signs and unlimited semiosis is, I think that he didn't really quite have access to, or had not made disposal of the later classifications. I'm sure this is very completely illegible to you, but it's a sort of derivative of 1903 syllabus on certain topics of logic, and then later 1905 pragmatism and pragmaticism, and several others. I should probably skip it, but I won't, because there's time. So you can see, I was under the impression that the fundamental dichotomies and divisions of the object dimension, for example, at the top we have the sign or reference dominant, and on the left there's the object, And I thought that the fundamental distinct divisions of the object was just icon, index, symbol, and then on the other hand, fundamental division of the interpretant, I thought was this bottom trichotomy of the Green-Dicey sign argument. But if you read more closely, actually, the fundamental divisions they begin with the immediate object and the dynamic object. It's actually the dynamic object which becomes icon, index, and the immediate object has its own divisions. And then the same can be said for the interpreter. I thought that the reading of the PC sign and the argument were fundamental. In fact, it's the immediate dynamic and final interpreton proceeds of that division, and we get otherwise that are unexplained. But regarding the ultimate interpretant and what happens when a deliberation over the dynamic object is discouraged is a matter of these other trichotomies, especially emotional, energetic, and logical. As I said, the original doctrine was that all signs are logical interpretants. Yes. But so if we can accept emotional and energetic interpretants as equally being interpretants, therefore completing the sign relation, then we can begin to describe what happens in ideology as inquiry into the dynamic object is discouraged, deliberation is discouraged, and the sign relation begins to become automatized. It doesn't collapse entirely, not in ideology, but we begin to behave more and more like robots, or like a loom, or like memes, if you will. But we need these distinctions in order to describe the decrease in adicity of the sign when automatization begins to mechanize the sign process. The adicity of the sign is the 1, 2, or 3 of any given trichotomy. I'm close. I'm very close, I assure you. There's one lengthy Peirce quote that goes through a bit of this, and I won't read the whole thing. I'll just paraphrase it. It's from 5.473, and it's about military obedience, and ground arms Peirce uses this example a lot. I don't know why, but it's when they have their rifles and the officer says ground arms, and then they put the butt of the rifle on the ground. And so in this case, it begins as a logical interpretant because initially the soldier, in order to correctly obey the command, has to think about it. But over time, practice becomes rigidified or habituated, yes, and more repetitive. Through repetition, habituation begins to happen, and eventually there's almost no thought. But what Peirce is saying here is that even in this case, it's still a sign because there is a certain level of deliberation over the dynamic object, but it becomes very much reduced. What originally was a concept or a logical interpretant, its adicity is reduced in the division of the immediate interpretant to an energetic interpretant. Rather than a logical interpretant, it's reduced to an energetic interpretant, and this is the kind of diagrammatic way of talking about the automatization of the sign. And he uses the example of actual properly dyadic signs, collapsed signs, signs that don't have an interpretant dimension. He uses a thermometer, example, where it's automatic, and there's no interpretant happening there. And he talks about symptoms also. Symptoms are also like according to Peirce, they're not signs, but Semiotic, for example, consider them signs. But they act in a purely brute or dyadic way. Like they're pure forms of secondness. And he uses this example because in ideology, it is as if we are approaching a robot-like or fully automatized state, but I guess you could say from the biosemiotic perspective, if we actually reached that state, we would be dead. Something like that. But he uses it as a limit case of what happens in the automatization process. Just a moment. And he calls them actually collapsed dyadic signs would be quasi-signs, as he says here. Automatically regulated, and he uses the example of a loom, a jacquard loom, which is a machine, a wooden machine you put in a pattern and it automatically creates tapestries or quilts or something like that. Productivity continues, yes, but there's no deliberation, there's no interpretant. I'm skipping ahead to yep. Absolutely, I'm there, I'm right there. T.L. Short summarizes, the aim of military training is precisely to reduce the need for collateral observation and deliberation to a minimum, to reduce the distinction between immediate and final interpretants to a minimum. And then down here, in this case, the command's interpretant is energetic, an energetic interpretant. Soldier understands the words, but he's not thinking about what they mean. He doesn't have to repeat them or translate them. There's a debate about what the ultimate interpretant is. This would take more explanation. It's not really necessary. It's still up in the air what the ultimate interpretant is. Is it the ultimate source of meaning in semiosis, or is it in fact a completely habituated dead sign? I'll leave that up to you. I have my own opinions. To conclude, why not? You might ask yourself, what's the point of using Peirce for ideology? Why try to revive this kind of passé discipline? But Eagelton, Terry Eagleton writes in the new preface to his book Marxism and Literary Theory, which he wrote in 2002, he writes, the inventors of the critique of ideology envisaged a world in which globalized market forces reigned supreme, careless of the human damage they inflicted, and in which the gap between rich and poor had widened intolerably. Amidst widespread political instability, the impoverished masses would confront a small international elite of the wealthy and powerful. It hardly needs to be pointed out that this is not just the world of the mid-Victorian era, but an alarmingly accurate portrayal of our own global situation. Critique of ideology has indeed, in our time, suffered the greatest defeat in its turbulent history. But why? Because the system it opposes has eased up, changed beyond recognition, thus rendering its theories redundant? In fact, for exactly the opposite reason. It is because that system is more powerful and pervasive than ever, because it is business as usual, only more so, that the political left has proved unable to break through. Oh, you mean like in scientific reasoning, the idea at the end of the historical destiny, there will be like a unification of world and sign and a grand symbol of the universe, this idea?
Yeah, rather the idea that ultimately we should all reach the same kind of direction, common sense.
Yeah, if we had sufficient access to the sign, we would achieve the final interpretant, which is the interpretant which we would all necessarily come to if we had sufficient access to the sign. Yeah, well, he also says that this can never happen, that it will never happen in human life. And I mean, it's an important question. It's simple, important distinction. Definitely bears upon the difference between the ultimate and final interpretant.
Yes. The relationship of ideology to the systems of values.
Of
values, from a theological point of view.
Yeah, absolutely, very important question. The postmodernists, according to Eagelton, maintain a distinction between factual judgments and value judgments. Yeah? And they'll say that value judgments have no truth conditions, and neither true nor false, and therefore of them we cannot speak regarding ideology. And Eagleton says this takes all the critical force out of critique of ideology. And what he insists upon is that this distinction between value judgments and fact judgments is insubstantial. And I think this works quite well with Peircean cynicism, because it's a member of the trichotomies. These normative sciences, it's a matter of gradation, so there's no hard and fast distinction according to truth conditions between value judgments and fact judgments, if that's what you mean.
Probably it is the matter of how to communicate in ideological community. And in ideology, you choose some particular values, yes, and the values may be promulgated in persuasion, in business strategies, etc. That is the big cloth of ideology. The rights of opinions, beliefs, etc. Not only of individual choices. Yes?
Sure. come on.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. I would just like to comment that, especially also it has to do with your question, that if you are regarding the ideologies and kind of habit production, we must have, or the habits itself, as you said, that are fixed at command and position, so it's a regulatory set of rules. So this production is continuously ongoing process of generation of interpretants. So it's not one single flow. It's like a distributed network, distributed in space, distributed in time. So I think that when you talk about the final interpretant, closure interpretant, how does it really, it could give us the idea that we're talking about one continuous flow, that we will reach something at the end of this process. And according to Peirce, it's not like that. So I would like to comment on that because it was not clear on this presentation.
I wouldn't associate ideology or semiotic closure with the final interpretant necessarily, or with the ultimate interpretant. I wouldn't associate ideology either with the final interpretant or the ultimate interpretant because it's not clear about that, and I don't think that Peirce's semiotics explicitly lends itself to the study of this kind of closure that I'm talking about, but indirectly he makes all sorts of statements which do approach this, specifically his statements in CP 5.4 about energetic, emotional, and logical distinctions, and the decreasing level of deliberation over the sign in these distinctions. Whether the very definition of even the final interpretant is highly disputed. I don't know if you've looked into T.L. Short's book, the one that I mentioned. Yeah, he blows the definition completely open, saying that any dynamic object can have a variety of different final interpretants, you know, as long as they're not mutually exclusive to each other, and so that provides for lots of open field. What did you call it? Open space of possibilities of different trajectories of habit change and so on. But also regarding habit change. Winfred Noth's article in the new Consensus on Peirce's Habit, there's this new book, 2016, he attempts to reformulate the idea of the ultimate interpretant from a habit which changes no more into the habit of habit change, so a habit that changes the most, if you will. And I could see that definition of the ultimate interpretant truly as the ultimate source of meaning. The question is then, is it no longer a sign? Because that's the one strong claim Peirce consistently made about the ultimate interpretant, is that it is a sign which does not become a new sign. And so is this habit as habit change? How could we possibly formulate habit as habit change as not being a new sign? Like, that's the confusion that I have about that. Because it seems to me habit change has to be a new sign. It has to, right? I don't know.
Okay, thank you. You can now join Tyler for lunch for further questions. But thank you, Tyler. Let's go to lunch, and we wait you back 5